The night before the Astor signing, I laid my suit out on the hotel bed, the way I always did before a major close. Jacket on the left, shirt folded underneath, tie already knotted, draped across the collar, briefcase packed and latched. A small titanium case inside it, no bigger than a cigarette lighter, that I had been carrying for 3 months without telling anyone it existed. I had done this routine before more than 50 closings in 20 years. It was not superstition. It was the only way I knew how to stay calm when everything around me was about to move very fast. What was different this time was that I already knew what was going to happen. Not approximately, not as a suspicion. I knew, and I had known for 6 months. So I folded my jacket, I set my alarm, I turned off the light. And in the morning, I went to go watch Preston Cole destroy himself in front of every person whose trust he was trying to borrow. Preston's exact words were, "You will not be needed anymore, Marcus. Security will escort you out." He did not lower his voice. He wanted the room to hear him. 15 CEOs were seated around that table, each one flown in from a different corner of the world. Tokyo, Munich, Oslo, Singapore, Sao Paulo, Toronto, Dubai, Shanghai. The contracts were printed. The folders were open. The pens were uncapped. We were 20 minutes away from signing a $2.4 billion international partnership that I had spent 6 months holding together with nothing but patience, precision, and 20 years of earned relationships. And that was the exact moment this 38-year-old CEO decided that my usefulness had expired. Before I tell you what happened in the 2 minutes after he said those words, I need to tell you about the 6 months that came before them. Because what happened in that ballroom did not begin in that ballroom. It began the day I realized Preston had never once read past the executive summary of a contract he did not write himself. And I filed that detail away like a man who intended to use it. My name is Marcus Holt. I am 52 years old. For 2 decades, I built Meridian Global Partners International Division from a single account into a portfolio that touched 14 countries and generated more than $4 billion in closed agreements. I did not do that with a personal brand or a LinkedIn following. I did it with the only currency that actually moves money at that level: trust. I knew every CEO in that room, not as contacts, as people. I knew Hiroshi Tanaka preferred to finalize terms in writing before any public handshake because his board required documented consensus before photographs. I knew Klaus Hoffmann flagged any clause that used the word discretionary without a bounded definition because a German consortium had cost him $8 million over that single word in 2011. I knew Rafael Costa from Sao Paulo needed 48 hours between the final revision and the signing date because his legal team operated across 3 time zones and had been burned before by rushed closings. I knew these things because I had spent years learning them. Preston knew none of them because to Preston, the CEOs in that room were not people with histories and preferences and hard-learned scars. They were a photograph, a press release, a number he could put in a shareholder report. That was his first mistake. The second one was thinking I did not see what he was doing. Preston Cole arrived at Meridian Global Partners 18 months before the Astor signing, and from the first week, he moved like a man who had already decided what needed to be cleared out. He did not say it to my face. Men like Preston rarely do. Instead, he let the language do the work. Fresh energy, digital native leadership, a more modern face for global expansion. He said these things in executive meetings while looking in my direction and then immediately past me, as if eye contact would require him to be honest about what he meant. He brought in a 32-year-old named Jennifer Pierce, Wharton MBA. Perfect slide voice. The kind of executive who could make a quarterly review sound like a TED Talk, but had never sat through a negotiation that lasted longer than a catered lunch. Preston started including her in meetings I was excluded from. He began copying her on correspondence I had previously handled alone. He scheduled calls with our international partners during hours when he knew I was traveling, then sent her summaries of conversations she had no context for. I watched all of this. I did not say a word. Not because I was afraid of him. Because I had spent 20 years in rooms with men who smiled while preparing your exit. And I had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do when someone is setting a trap is let them know you can see the edges of it. The moment I understood the full shape of his plan was 3 weeks before the Astor signing. He had accidentally copied me on an internal scheduling email for the event. The subject line read, "Leadership Refresh, Photography, Coverage." He had not just planned to replace me. He had planned to photograph the replacement. I printed the email. I folded it once. I put it in the inside pocket of my briefcase against the lining, where it stayed for the next 21 days. And then I went back to work. What I need you to understand is that the $2.4 billion partnership I was managing was not a standard acquisition. It was a consortium agreement involving 15 independent entities across 12 legal jurisdictions, each with its own regulatory requirements, its own cultural protocols, and its own senior leadership, who had agreed to this deal for reasons that were specific to them. The agreement had taken 11 months to architect. It had survived 4 rounds of revision, 2 near collapses, and 1 complete restructuring of the liability framework after a late change in Singapore's foreign investment regulations. The reason it survived all of that was not because of Meridian's brand. It was because of me. Every CEO at that table had come to trust the process because they trusted the person managing it. That is not a soft concept. In international M&A at this scale, relationship continuity is a documented risk factor. Major agreements frequently include specific language requiring that the principal liaison remain in place through the final execution stage, because the legal and commercial risks of a relationship reset in the final 24 hours are real and measurable. I had been writing that kind of clause into complex agreements for 15 years. And 6 months before the Astor signing, I wrote it into this one. The clause itself was not dramatic. That was the point. It was buried in the mutual obligations framework of Section 9, written in precise, neutral legal language that sounded like standard continuity protection. It did not mention my name with fanfare. It did not read as personal. It read the way I needed it to read, like a responsible provision that any experienced deal counsel would include in an agreement of this complexity. It said, in the event the designated principal liaison is removed from active participation prior to final execution, all memoranda of understanding contained herein shall be rendered immediately void without further notice or cure period. Not delayed. Not subject to arbitration. Void. And in every version of the agreement, every revision, every document that the 15 CEOs and their legal teams had reviewed and approved, I was listed as the designated principal liaison. I presented the clause to each partner separately, in their own language, framed as protection for them, not as a safeguard for me. I told Hiroshi that no serious investor should commit 11 months of executive attention to a process only to have the relationship reset at the final hour by someone who had no context for what had been built. I told Klaus that continuity reduced jurisdictional risk across every execution stage. With the delegation from Beijing, I spoke in Mandarin about Guanxi, about the specific quality of trust that cannot be reprinted on a new business card. Every conversation was different. The message was the same. You are trusting this deal because of the person who built it. That person needs to remain at the table until the ink is dry. One by one, they agreed. Some saw it as common sense. A few understood exactly what I was doing and signed anyway, because they had been in rooms with enough press-ons in their careers to know that the clause was not protecting me. It was protecting the deal from him. But the clause was only the first lock. The second one required something a little more technical. 3 years earlier, after a competitor nearly inserted a falsified approval into one of our international closings, I worked with outside counsel to build a final authentication process for Meridian's largest agreements. The system required a single encrypted digital signature, applied through a hardware security token, to convert the executed memoranda into legally timestamped, court-admissible instruments. The token was issued to me personally, stored off the company's server, protected by a passcode only I held. Any attempt to access the files without proper authentication would send immediate alerts to my personal attorney and to outside counsel. Preston had inherited this system when he took over. He had never questioned it. He had never asked how it worked. He had signed off on the security protocol summary the same way he signed off on everything that did not have a camera pointed at it, without a second thought. The token was in the titanium case in my briefcase. The briefcase was sitting beside my chair, and when security came to escort me out of that ballroom, I picked it up, buttoned my jacket, and walked toward the door, carrying everything Preston needed and would never have. I want to describe the 30 seconds after Preston said those words, because it is the part nobody who was not in that room has ever quite believed when I tell it. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not say a single word. I simply closed my folder, stood, and pushed my chair back in. That sound, the chair legs on the marble floor, was the only sound in that room for a full 3 seconds. Then something shifted. It started with the pens, one by one around the table. Pens that had been hovering over signature pages were set down. Folders that had been spread open were pulled closed. Assistants stopped typing mid-sentence. Interpreters looked at one another, and the 15 CEOs, men and women who had been in enough rooms to know what a deal collapse looks like in its first 10 seconds, made a collective calculation that Preston could not see because he was still smiling at the head of the table. The person who built this is leaving. The trust is leaving with him.
Preston moved into my chair with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He straightened his jacket. He opened the memorandum in front of him. He said, with genuine certainty, "Let us proceed."
Nobody proceeded. Bjorn Larson from Oslo was the first to speak. He leaned back slowly, folded his hands on the table, and looked directly at Preston. He asked him to clarify the scope and application of Clause 17. Clause 17 was the jurisdictional risk-sharing provision. I had written it, revised it 14 times, and defended it on conference calls that ran past midnight through 3 time zones. Preston had been in none of those calls. His thumb pressed hard against the edge of the page as he scanned it, and for one brief, visible second, the smile disappeared. Then Klaus Hoffmann's voice came across the table, calm and flat as a closed door. "Without Marcus, who ensures our terms are honored?" That was not a question. That was the room telling Preston what he had just done. He started flipping pages, speaking too quickly, trying to sound prepared while the mathematics of the situation assembled itself in real time around him. I was already near the door, but I was not in a hurry. I had nowhere to be. Then Bjorn stood. He buttoned his jacket the way a man buttons his jacket when the meeting is over and he has already decided what comes next. He looked at Preston and spoke with the measured quiet of a man who had no reason to be loud. As per the diplomatic clause, our memorandum of understanding is now void. Without the named liaison present at execution, there is no agreement. Preston blinked. Then he said, quickly, that they could still move forward, that consensus on the major terms was sufficient, that if everyone would remain seated, they could work through the procedural question together. But Bjorn was already closing his briefcase. Rafael Costa from Sao Paulo stood, then Michel Dubois from Toronto, then the delegation from Singapore, then Tokyo, then Munich, then Dubai, then Shanghai. One by one, the chairs pushed back from the table. Folders closed. Pens went into jacket pockets. Assistants whispered into phones. The room that Preston had planned to photograph as his defining moment began emptying like a theater after the lights come up. Preston said, "Please." No one looked back. Klaus Hoffmann was the last to leave the table. He walked the length of it without hurrying, past Preston and the open folders and the uncapped pens, and stopped in front of me near the door. He extended his hand. He said quietly that I had always been the deal, not the company, not the title. Me. I shook his hand without speaking. In the hallway outside the ballroom, Jennifer Pierce was standing with her tablet pressed to her chest, wearing the expression of someone who has just watched the floor disappear from under a chair she had not yet sat in. No one introduced her. No one asked her name. The future Preston had been building for her for 6 months, walked past her in a line of international CEOs without stopping. Behind me, I could hear Preston's voice rising inside the ballroom. "Get legal on the line now." A speakerphone clicked on. Then our chief counsel's voice filled the room, and I slowed my steps just enough to hear the part that mattered. She told him the diplomatic clause under Section 9 was clear. Without the named liaison's participation at final execution, all memoranda of understanding were void. And without Marcus Holt's encrypted signature, the authentication system would not validate the contracts. Preston told her to override it. She said 2 words. "You cannot." She explained that any attempt to bypass the authentication process would trigger immediate legal alerts to external counsel, that the system had been built specifically to prevent unauthorized execution. There was a silence after that. Not the powerful kind, the helpless kind. The kind that comes when a man realizes, too late, that confidence is not the same as preparation. Outside the Astor, the air was colder than I expected. Or maybe I just noticed it for the first time in months. I walked down the granite steps slowly, carrying the same briefcase that Preston thought security had taken from me. Behind those glass doors, I could hear the sound of a $2.4 billion deal being declared void in front of the people it was supposed to impress. My phone buzzed before I reached the bottom of the steps. It was Hiroshi Tanaka. He spoke in Japanese. He was calm, the way he was always calm, the way a man is calm when he has already decided something and is simply informing you of it. He said they would like me to advise the next phase of their expansion, not through Meridian, independently, full negotiating authority, full budget approval. I stopped walking. He said they did not want the company. They wanted the trust. When his call ended, a message from Klaus appeared on my screen. "If you are available, we want you to lead our portion as well. Same conditions, only with you at the helm." Then a message from a Singapore investor who had been undecided for 3 months. "Prepared to sign once Marcus Holt is confirmed as lead negotiator." In the time it took me to walk from the Astor's front doors to the corner of the block, Preston had lost the room. And someone had handed me the keys to it. 3 months later, my name was on a door that I owned. Holt & Associates, International M&A Advisory. A boutique firm built for the kind of work most large companies claim to understand and actually cannot do. No photography budget, no leadership refresh emails, no 38-year-old CEO practicing executive presence in front of a mirror. Just trust, strategy, and the people who understood the value of both. Hiroshi, Klaus, and Arjun from Singapore became founding partners. 3 men who had walked out of the Astor ballroom without signing anything were now sitting across from me as equals. The first deal we closed was worth $2.8 billion, larger than the one Preston destroyed. 16 CEOs at the table this time. Not 15, every one of them there because they knew exactly who was leading the negotiation. My name was printed at the top of the final agreement. Lead negotiating advisor. I read those words longer than I probably needed to. Because for 20 years, I had built bridges that other men crossed and took credit for. I had held rooms together that other men posed in front of. I had earned trust that other men borrowed without acknowledgement. And I had told myself each time that the work was the point, that the results were the record, that a man who knew his own value did not need to hear it confirmed. But sitting in that room with my name at the top of the page, I understood something I had not let myself admit before. It matters, not for the ego, not for the applause. Because when your name is on the door, the 20 years are finally visible. The midnight calls, the missed birthdays, the red-eye flights where you wake up not knowing what country you are in, the moments that cost you things you cannot get back. They are visible. And so are you. The afternoon the final agreement was signed, Klaus stepped into my office, carrying something I did not immediately recognize. A black pen. He set it on the edge of my desk without speaking, and for a moment I just looked at it. Then I remembered. It was the pen he had left on the table at the Astor. The pen he had refused to sign with the morning. Preston fired me and the room emptied. In certain circles, at a certain level of business, a pen left behind on a table carries a specific meaning. The agreement is over, permanently. Klaus gave me a faint smile. He said he thought I should have it, that it belonged to the person who had kept the deal honest. I held it for a long time without speaking. Not because I was overwhelmed, because I was calculating, in that quiet way I have always calculated things, what those words actually meant. 20 years of being the invisible structure underneath someone else's building. 20 years of delivering without a byline. 20 years of watching men like Preston take a seat at a table. I had spent a decade setting and assumed the furniture came with the chair. And now a man I respected deeply was handing me a pen and telling me the trust had always been mine. I set it on the corner of my desk. It stays there now, not as a trophy, as a reminder of something I plan never to forget again. That same evening, my phone rang. I almost did not answer it. I was reading through the executed agreement, making sure every clause was clean, every jurisdiction accounted for. The work never fully stops. Anyone who has done this long enough knows that. But I looked at the screen and I answered it. It was my son. He did not say much. He had heard about the firm through someone in his network, he said. He wanted to know if the stories were accurate. I told him they were. There was a pause. Then he said he was proud of me. I did not have a prepared response for that. 20 years of negotiations, and that was the sentence I had no answer for. I said thank you. I told him I had a lot of things I had done wrong that I could not undo. He said he knew. I said I hoped there was still time to do some of them differently. He said there was. We talked for 22 minutes. Not about the deal. Not about Preston. About ordinary things, the kind of things I had missed too many years of. When we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time in the dark. Some victories do not announce themselves. Some of them arrive quietly, on an evening when the work is done and the room is empty, in the voice of someone who decided you were still worth a phone call. Preston was removed from Meridian's board 6 weeks after the Astor collapse. No press release. No farewell speech. No leadership refresh email. A closed-door meeting, a legal review, and the unavoidable conclusion that he had destroyed a $2.4 billion partnership in front of 15 international witnesses and left the company with voided contracts, damaged relationships, and a senior executive who had taken his expertise to a competitor. Last I heard, he accepted a role at a mid-sized firm in Chicago. Not as CEO, not as a visionary. He reports to a 55-year-old vice president who does not care about personal branding or executive photography or the kind of language. That sounds impressive, until someone asks a real question. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard that. I felt something quieter. Recognition, maybe, of something I had understood for a long time but never needed confirmed until now. Power that has to announce itself is not power. It is performance. Real power is what remains in the room after the performance is over. Preston announced himself loudly in that ballroom. And when the room emptied, he was the only one still there. I left with my briefcase. I left with my reputation. I left with the trust of 15 people who understood what had just happened before Preston did. And I left with a small titanium case that held the only signature that could have made his deal legal. He thought he was removing the old guard. He never realized the old guard was holding the key. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment below. Would you have stayed silent and built the trap? Or would you have confronted him the moment you saw the leadership refresh email? I want to know what you would have done. And if you believe that real preparation always outlasts borrowed confidence, subscribe to this channel for more stories about betrayal, quiet strategy, and the kind of justice that does not need to announce itself.